Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hey, you can do this. Because this is Airwindows Dubly2. So you might wonder what the heck this is about. Well, a while back, I was working on tape style processing, and it occurred to me it would be interesting to explore the noise reduction system that is known in Spinal Tap as Dubly. You know how they say, oh, you can't use Dubly in heavy metal. Well, actually, I think you can, but that's because I've just written the plugin Dubly, and this is the plugin Dubly2. As you can see, we've got encode amount, encode frequency, tape drive, which is currently all cranked up, decode amount, decode frequency, out pad, and a dry wet. So what does this thing actually do? Well, this type of processing works in a particular way. The full-on real-world version of the meme Dubly is used to do multiple sort of brightened, filtered, compressed to a very specific ratio versions of the overall sound, which are then added to the sound, making the end result a lot brighter. And then you record that to tape, and then you play the tape back, you run it through a very similar processing. But in this case, you do the brightened and compressed sound, and then you subtract it. Now, what's interesting about that is that's not completely reversible. We don't actually have something like, some of my versions of console where it's designed to exactly remove what was added. Instead, it's a noise reduction technique. It does a different sort of thing. And I can demonstrate that by skipping to, for instance, a bit in the end where there's a guitar solo. Baby, you got your eyes. And here's our tape drive. But if you weren't applying anything, it's basically flat. This is no processing. I'm going to just take a moment and tighten up the loop a little bit. If we use encode amount, this becomes only the encode of the Dubly. This is what you add. And we can make it very bright. Or, if you were only going to try the decode amount, it does this. See, as you turn it up a little bit more, you're subtracting the high frequencies, but it's a sort of compressed and brightened version that you're then taking back out. So if you push that even farther, what you're going to get is baby, you got your eyes. A kind of wildly out of sync thing. You can't simply do encode all the way, decode all the way, and get anything reasonable. Instead, you get this. It's completely screwed up. But that's because you're not meant to do that. The reason I'm allowing for these extreme settings is because this is Dubly. I get to let you do whatever you want with it. And I've got my settings of 0.5 for the amount and frequency and so on as a nice sort of happy medium. Something where the result that you get when you do it, you turn it off and this is just dry, and you turn it on and you get some of that texture from your classic records from that noise reduction system. But it's not anything like an exact clone of that noise reduction system. Instead, it is the basic concept of that noise reduction system. For instance, the encoding, rather than doing all kinds of complicated compressors and things, I'm basically using U-Law encode because it uses the same ratio that you end up with, and it actually works out just fine. For instance, let's go to encode only. And we'll pad it a little bit. So there you are. We've got a brightness, but this is doubly. This is not anything else. And then you can use the frequency control to dial in whatever tone that you might like. And as long as you keep the encode amount and the decode amount to not too extreme, I've got it turned up to 1 just to show off what the thing sounds like. If you keep it at reasonable levels, pretty much any frequency control that you set should still do the basic job of what we're talking about. And we'll experiment with that now. Here's 0.237 on both of those. And then if we make the encode amount and decode amount to 0.5, start with turning it off, and then we'll turn it on and hear what it sounds like when we're crossing it over a lot lower. Now. And crossed over this low, it's quite a strong effect, so we can also play with the settings. For instance, maybe we'll want a lower amount. .4. And we can also stop padding it this much. Dry. And the effect. And we can also make it be out of balance for playing the system like the system is slightly out of adjustment, because there's other things you can do around that, where you can set it up, tweak it slightly in one direction or another, have maybe the frequencies be slightly different between the encode and the decode. Each of those things is going to cause its own unique little tonal difference. For instance, here we've got the encode a little bit hot, decode can be a little more than that, but not that much. And we could have the encode frequency still being at 0.237. Remember, 0.5 is my default there. And then we'll bring the decode frequency up so that that is more like a normal one. This should produce a kind of weird, aggressive, compressy sound, but more in the lower mids. And we'll hear that now. Doesn't want to go to exactly 0.5. And of course we can switch over to a different track that you've been hearing recently for demonstrations of tape style effects, because this is quite an old mix, and one of the things about it is this one is considerably louder. So if you slam this one, it should really show off the sound of what it would be like to slam tape. And we've heard this before. So that is fairly flat. Bypass, engage. And that's with a little more low mids. And Discord oozed right through the screen like horror from Japan. And they sang Discord welcome home. And then you can do this. You're here. Discord welcome home. We've longed for this for years. We're here. So interestingly, this is not actually using tape saturation emulation. Not yet. This is Dubly2. This is the Dubly algorithm all by itself. Just like Flutter2 was the Flutter algorithm for 2tape7 all by itself. 2tape7 will also include Dubly. If you don't want it engaged, then turn encode amount and decode amount down to 0. If you want to use it, I think my 0.5 settings that it defaults to are probably going to be fine. And of course, tape drive and outpad are going to be their own things in 2tape7. But this should really do a good job of bringing more of that tape mojo to tape 7. And we're not quite done yet either, because on Thursday, on a live stream, I got pretty much all the way through doing a bias plugin. And tape bias, of course, is very much its own thing. It affects the way that you hit loud peaks, and you can overbias or underbias. Because in the last week or so, one of the things I was able to do is book time on a web-based rent hardware over the internet kind of thing. You probably heard of it. And I got to run audio through real tape machines at a reasonably high quality. And there was a Studer and a Telefunken tape machine. The Studer is definitely somewhat overbiased, and you could hear the bias frequency. And the Telefunken was underbiased. So I had real-world tape references to check out in dialing in these things. Although I don't know if they were using Dolby. But then this isn't Dolby, this is Dubly. It should do the same basic thing, but cleaner and more efficiently, because the algorithm is stripped down to produce the effect, rather than like painstakingly mimicking all the little details of how the other non-Dubly effect is. You'll note I'm not saying it very often because it's like that's somebody else's trademark, but Dubly is a reference to this is Spinal Tap. And Dubly2 is the new version of that, where you can use it for whatever you like. And that most definitely includes that trick that people do where they dial in a crazy high frequency boost by using the encode twice. You can totally do that. And if you want to use this to actually have two separate plugins, because you might notice we've got a distortion in here, but it is not a full-on tape emulation. Here's what you do. For the encode, turn decode amount down to 0. For the decode, turn encode amount down to 0 and the decode amount to whatever you want. And then just use 2 copies of the plugin and you're good. Simple as that. There will be a little extra, it's basically sine-based distortion there, but that's very gentle, so you shouldn't have too much trouble with that. And the final version will go into the upcoming plugin to tape 7, which will have Flutter2. It will have Dubly2 built in with all the controls that we see here. Might go all the way up to like a whole 10 slider thing, but it'll also be available in Airwindows Consolidated, because I'm going to make a point of that being the case. And it will have the new azimuth control, which I worked out how to approximate the sound of both underbiasing and overbiasing. And for that one, the setting in the middle is no effect. But it's very common to do a little tiny bit of overbiasing, and so you'll be able to dial that in as well. I expect to be doing this and doing a little comparing and making sure that I can give you a set of settings that will exactly replicate the Studer and the Telefunken that I was able to measure. And for a good measure, I'll probably also throw in, like, I've got a cassette deck that I have not yet started experimenting with, and I ought to be able to throw in a bunch of settings to do that as well. VHS tape, who knows what. 2tape7 is going to cover all the bases, and that's going to be a lot of fun. Until then, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.